Members of the Obama administration signaled this weekend that more TARP funds won't be needed as members of Congress continue to question how taxpayer money has been spent. Congressman Darrell Issa is the ranking Republican on the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He's called for an independent committee to study the U.S. financial crisis, and he joins me here on set. Congressman Issa, nice to meet you. Welcome to Bloomberg.
Thanks for having me on live.
Sir, the administration signaling this weekend that they won't need more TARP funds. Does that raise any red flags for you? Any concerns?
Well, I think when Hank Greenberg came in and told us they didn't need at least $100 billion of
the
what
former chair of AIG.
The former chair of AIG, $100 billion of the $180 billion that AIG got if they'd handled it properly. I think they're beginning to realize that public confidence coming from the federal government is not just public money. And so I'm happy that that's happening. But of course, we do have trillions of dollars pledged and $800 or $700 billion spent, not including stimulus money. So we've got a lot to keep track of that's already happened.
Are you convinced that they won't need more TARP funds, or do you think at some point in the future they're going to have to come back?
Well, first you have to realize that the major banks are begging to give the money back. That money will not come back into the Treasury. That money will be available within the net TARP. So I think part of what they're looking at is if they need more money, they'll basically be taking it from Citi or Wells Fargo and recycling it.
So are you saying that if the banks say that they don't need any more and they can start giving it back, that might be a little bit misleading given where the money might go?
It is. If they pay it back, my understanding of the TARP, it's not like a one-time. They can, in fact, reuse that. So the fact that the banks want to give it back, that major banks are going to be in a position to go out for new capital and perhaps buy up weaker banks is business as usual, the way it was before we panicked last September.
Last month, you and I spoke. You were on the Hill, and you said at that time that you were concerned about a lack of transparency in this whole process. Is that the reason you're calling for an independent commission, and who would comprise this commission?
Well, first of all, we'd have to find people who were not actually at the helm trying to cover it up. That would include Barney Frank. That would include Greenspan and Bernanke, because each of them has a theory that it wasn't their fault.
Well, that's pretty tough. You're actually assigning blame? You think that the blame may have come from Capitol Hill?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question that for 2 decades, we pushed banks to make loans to people who couldn't pay them back, to create new instruments that would allow people to buy homes that otherwise wouldn't be able to. And we finally based that on the idea that homes were only going to go up in value. So the idea that homes were only going to go up in value, everyone should be ashamed of. But the basic tenet of you must find ways to provide people loans, no matter what their past credit is, no matter what their income is something we've got to reevaluate before we start loaning again. And we also have Freddie and Fannie, which are essentially government assets now. Are we going to reprivatize them? Are we going to break them up? What are we going to do with them? Those questions and more need to be answered in a way that people don't see somebody protecting their turf.
Well, speaking of Fannie, they appointed today Michael Williams, President and Chief Executive Officer, who is Fannie's Vice President and COO. Any thoughts on the appointment?
Well, they haven't been asked to fundamentally change yet, and we are in fact backing them with full faith and credit. And they also, quite frankly, $500,000 for a CEO is something that President Obama has limited, but a government entity normally makes a quarter of that. So there's a lot of those kinds of questions that have to be answered. I personally believe Freddie and Fannie should be broken up into small enough pieces that we no longer have to look at them as one entity that either succeeds or fails. And that's part of what I'd like to see, an independent commission like the 9/11 Commission, look at many of these issues, advise Congress. We don't have to take all their advice, but at least their advice would be one that the President would have to look at and be willing to defend if he didn't do it. The House and Senate would have to look at and be willing to defend if they didn't take the recommendations. And I believe that's the only way to get the kind of a post-disaster that isn't going to simply lead us down the road to doing the same thing again in another 10 years.
Congressman, we have about 30 seconds left. Even as the banks try and return their TARP money, they're still benefiting tremendously from other government programs like the FDIC. Should they have to give up that assistance if they want to return the TARP money?
No, I think that that guarantees or underwriting of companies, if in fact the FDIC in this case has evaluated that their real worth, their non-mark-to-market worth, if you will, is sufficient, those kinds of assurances are reasonable. Standing behind banks with bank auditors making sure that it's valid is the kind of thing we should have done all along. That's the part that those of us who voted against the TARP were fighting for.
Congressman Darrell Issa of California joining us here on set. Sir, thank you very much for coming in. Pleasure to meet you. IBM's